There are moments in music that feel impossible to move beyond. January 7, 2020 was one of those moments. When the world learned that Neil Peart had passed away after a battle with brain cancer, millions of fans felt like an era had ended. For many, Rush was never just a band. It was a unique combination of three musicians whose chemistry seemed impossible to replace. And at the center of that chemistry sat Neil Peart. His drumming wasn't simply about speed or technical skill, it was about imagination. Every fill told a story. Every song felt like a journey. To countless drummers around the world, Neil wasn't just a musician. He was the reason they picked up drumsticks in the first place. That's why, for years after his passing, many fans believed Rush would never perform again. How could they? How do you replace someone who helped define the very identity of a band? The answer, as it turns out, was that you don't. Years later, as Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson slowly began playing together again, they weren't searching for another Neil Peart. They knew that was impossible. Instead, they were looking for someone who could honor his legacy while bringing something genuine of their own. And that's when a name began appearing in conversations: Anika Nilles. At first, many Rush fans didn't know who she was. She wasn't the obvious choice. She wasn't the drummer most fan forums were predicting. But behind the scenes, Geddy Lee had already heard impressive things about her through his longtime bass technician who had worked with the late Jeff Beck. Lee later explained that he looked her up and discovered a remarkable musician whose talent had already earned respect throughout the drumming world. What happened next would eventually convince Geddy and Alex that the future of Rush's music might be safer than anyone imagined. But before Anika could win over thousands of fans, she first had to survive a challenge that many drummers would consider impossible. She had to step into the shadow of Neil Peart. And in the next chapter, we'll look at the audition that changed everything, and the moment Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson realized they may have found the right person for one of the most difficult jobs in rock history. For years, Rush had been a band defined by chemistry that could not be faked. Geddy Lee's voice and bass, Alex Lifeson's guitar textures, and Neil Peart's complex drumming all locked together like three parts of the same machine. After Neil's passing, the idea of restarting that machine felt almost impossible. But music has a way of finding new paths when people are willing to listen. When Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson started jamming again, it wasn't a reunion tour plan, it was more personal than that. According to interviews, they were simply reconnecting with the joy of playing together after years of silence. They didn't rush into decisions. They didn't announce anything. They just played. Behind the scenes, however, the question kept returning: if this ever became something more, who could possibly play drums? That search didn't begin with fame or hype. It began with trust. Anika Nilles first came onto their radar through connections in the music world. Geddy Lee has said he learned about her through his bass tech, who had worked with top-tier artists and strongly recommended her playing. Curious, Geddy checked out her performances and was immediately struck by her precision, creativity, and control. She wasn't trying to imitate Neil Peart. That was important. Instead, she had her own voice on the drums, tight, modern, and deeply musical. That balance mattered more than anyone expected. Eventually, she was invited to meet and play with Geddy and Alex. There was no public announcement, no media build-up, just musicians in a room testing something fragile. And that's where things got interesting. Because the challenge wasn't just technical skill. Any professional drummer at her level could handle complexity. The real test was emotional awareness, knowing when to push forward, when to pull back, and how to serve songs that millions of fans already associate with a legendary sound. For Geddy and Alex, this wasn't about replacing Neil Peart. It was about discovering whether Rush could still breathe in a new form. And during those early sessions, something unexpected started to happen. They weren't just hearing a capable drummer, they were hearing possibilities. But even then, the hardest part was still ahead. Because no matter how good the chemistry felt in the room, the real test would come from the fans, the people who have carried Neil Peart's legacy for decades. And that reaction was never going to be simple. In rock music, some names don't fade, they grow heavier with time. Neil Peart is one of those names. For generations of drummers, his work with Rush wasn't just influential, it was foundational. Songs like Tom Sawyer, Limelight, and YYZ became masterclasses in precision, storytelling, and endurance. Even decades later, drum forums, interviews, and breakdown videos still analyze his techniques bar by bar. So when news of a new drummer working with Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson began to spread quietly, the reaction was immediate and divided. Some fans felt hope. Others felt resistance. Because replacing Neil Peart was never really an option. It wasn't a matter of skill. It was about identity. Neil didn't just play for Rush, he helped define what Rush was. That's why Anika Nilles stepping into the conversation felt so sensitive to many longtime listeners. But here is where the reality becomes important. According to multiple interviews, Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson were very clear. They were not looking for a replacement for Neil Peart. They understood that his role in the band was irreplaceable. Instead, they were exploring whether Rush's music could exist in a new form, one that respected the past without pretending to recreate it. .coreworld.com. That distinction matters more than it seems, because it changes the entire expectation placed on the drummer. Anika Nilles was not being asked to be Neil Peart. She was being asked something arguably harder, to interpret Rush's musical language in a way that felt authentic, alive, and respectful. And that is where her reputation as a modern drummer became important. Known for her work as a solo artist and educator, Nilles has built a style that blends technical complexity with groove and clarity. Her playing often focuses on precision and composition rather than imitation, which is part of why she stood out in the first place. In early sessions, that difference became noticeable in a good way. Instead of copying iconic fills note for note, she approached the material with restraint and musical intelligence, something Geddy Lee has often emphasized as essential for Rush's sound. But even as the chemistry improved in the room, one truth remained unavoidable. The real world is not a rehearsal space, and once the idea of continuing Rush's legacy started to move beyond private sessions, the pressure would multiply instantly. Because fans weren't just going to hear a new drummer, they were going to hear a memory being reinterpreted. And the question quietly hanging over everything was this: would they accept it or reject it completely? The answer would begin to surface in ways nobody fully expected. As talk around Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and new drumming possibilities grew, something familiar started happening again. The Rush fan base split into conversations, debates, and deep analysis. Some listeners leaned into excitement, others became protective of what they felt was sacred. That tension is not new in music history. Whenever a legendary lineup changes, the first reaction is rarely acceptance, it is comparison. And in Rush's case, the comparison has one name at the center of everything: Neil Peart. What makes his legacy so powerful is not just the technical brilliance, but the emotional identity he built into the band. His lyrics, his storytelling approach, and his unique drumming phrasing turned Rush into something far beyond a traditional rock trio. So when discussions about modern drummers like Anika Nilles entered the conversation, the expectations became unrealistically high almost instantly. It is important to be clear here, as of confirmed public information, Rush has not officially announced a permanent new drummer or a full band continuation in the traditional sense. What exists publicly are discussions, collaborations, and ongoing speculation about how Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson might approach music going forward in any form. Still, within that space of possibility, names like Nilles naturally come up because of her reputation. And that reputation is not built on hype, it is built on performance. In online drum communities, her work is often discussed for its control, independence, and clarity, qualities that matter deeply in complex rock arrangements. She is known for playing with precision without losing feel, something that separates professional session-level drummers from casual performers. But even with that respect, one truth remains constant in every discussion: no drummer is being evaluated as a replacement for Neil Peart. That idea itself has been rejected repeatedly by musicians close to Rush's legacy. Instead, the focus has shifted toward interpretation, how classic material might be played live or reimagined without trying to recreate the past exactly. And that shift is important, because it protects Neil Peart's legacy rather than diluting it. It ensures that his work remains untouched in its original form, while still allowing musicians to explore what comes next without pretending history can be duplicated. Still, fans continue to ask the same emotional question: can Rush's spirit survive without the man who helped define it? And slowly, a different answer begins to emerge, not through replacement, but through respect. But the real turning point in this story isn't just about skill or speculation. It's about what happens when musicians choose to honor a legacy instead of chasing it. And that moment is where everything begins to change. For decades, Neil Peart's legacy was defined by something larger than performance. It was defined by influence. Even after his passing in 2020, his impact didn't slow down. It multiplied. Young drummers continued breaking down his solos online. Music schools continued referencing his phrasing. Entire generations who never saw Rush live still study his work like a blueprint. That is what makes his legacy different from most musicians. It is still actively being learned. And this is where the story of modern drummers like Anika Nilles becomes more meaningful, even beyond Rush itself. Because the real question isn't whether someone can replace Neil Peart. It is whether his influence is strong enough to shape the next generation without needing replacement at all. In interviews and public discussions, Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson have made it clear that they are not interested in recreating Rush as it once was. That chapter is complete. Instead, any future music or collaboration is about honoring what existed while allowing space for new interpretation and energy. Gano porportasen. This approach quietly protects Neil Peart's legacy in a powerful way because it refuses to turn him into a slot that someone else fills. And for musicians like Nilles, who are often discussed in these conversations, the focus becomes something different entirely. Not imitation, not replacement, but respect through musicianship. Her reputation as a drummer is built on control, musical intelligence, and independence, traits that allow her to adapt to complex material without losing identity. That is exactly why she is often mentioned in professional circles when discussions about high-level drumming projects come up. But what truly matters in this larger story is not any single drummer. It is the realization that Neil Peart's influence has become so deeply embedded in rock music that it no longer depends on one band or one performance era. It lives in technique. It lives in composition. It lives in how drummers think about storytelling behind a kit. And that is why his legacy feels safe, even in a world where new musicians are constantly evolving the language he helped expand. Because the greatest legacies are not preserved by copying them. They are preserved by understanding them. And as this story moves toward its final conclusion, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Neil Peart may have left the stage, but the way he changed it is still shaping everything that follows. When people talk about legacy in music, they often imagine something fragile, something that can be lost if the right person is not there to hold it together. But Neil Peart's legacy is proving to be something different. It is not fragile. It is self-sustaining. Across the world, drummers continue to study his work in detail, not just for speed or complexity, but for structure and storytelling. His approach to drumming turned rhythm into narrative, where every fill had purpose and every transition felt intentional. That influence is now part of modern drumming itself. This is why conversations around musicians like Anika Nilles matter in a broader sense. Not because anyone is trying to replace Neil Peart, but because his legacy has already shaped the standards that new drummers are measured against. And in professional circles, Nilles is often recognized for meeting those high standards in her own way. Her playing is precise, controlled, and deeply musical, qualities that reflect how far modern drumming has evolved under the influence of players like Peart. But the most important truth in this entire story is simple. Neil Peart does not need to be replaced to remain relevant. His work continues to live through every drummer who approaches the instrument with thought, discipline, and creativity, and that is exactly what makes his legacy safe. Not because it is protected by comparison, but because it has already become part of the foundation. Rush may never return in the exact form the world once knew. That chapter belongs to history now. But the music, the influence, and the inspiration remain active forces. And somewhere in that ongoing story, musicians like Anika Nilles represent something important, not a continuation of Neil Peart, but a reminder of what he helped make possible. In the end, that is the real measure of a legacy, not whether it can be duplicated, but whether it continues to inspire something new long after the final note has faded. And for Neil Peart, that answer is already clear. His legacy is not just safe, it is still growing.